They had trained for this moment since boot camp. Japanese infantry soldiers, crouched in defensive positions along the ridgeline above the Matanikau River on Guadalcanal, checked their rifles one final time in the pre-dawn darkness of October 23, 1942. The Arisaka Type 38 bolt-action rifle each man carried was a familiar weight, an extension of the soldier's body after months or years of rigorous training. They had fired thousands of practice rounds, learned to work the bolt with mechanical precision, mastered the art of aimed fire that Japanese doctrine insisted would win battles through superior marksmanship and discipline. The Americans were coming. Intelligence reports indicated a Marine battalion was advancing through the jungle below, moving toward Japanese positions with the overconfidence typical of Western soldiers. The Japanese infantrymen were not concerned. They had their rifles, they had advantageous terrain, and they had absolute faith in their training. American soldiers, they had been told, were soft, undisciplined, reliant on material wealth rather than fighting spirit. American rifles were likely no better than their own, perhaps inferior given the Yankees' preference for industrial shortcuts over craftsmanship. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What happened in the firefight that morning would fundamentally alter Japanese infantry doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War. It would force Japanese military planners to confront an uncomfortable truth about modern infantry combat, a truth that their doctrine, their training, and their entire philosophy of warfare had not prepared them to face. The issue was not courage or marksmanship or fighting spirit. The issue was rate of fire, and the Americans, it turned out, could fire much, much faster than anyone in the Imperial Japanese Army had anticipated. The weapon that shattered Japanese assumptions was not a machine gun or a new artillery piece. It was a standard-issue infantry rifle, carried by nearly every Marine and soldier in the American forces. It was the M1 Garand, and it represented a revolution in infantry firepower that Japanese planners had either overlooked or fundamentally misunderstood. The Garand was not dramatically more accurate than the Arisaka. It did not have a longer effective range. What it had was the ability to fire 8 rounds as fast as a rifleman could pull the trigger, without requiring the soldier to work a bolt action between shots. That difference, seemingly small on paper, proved decisive in combat. It meant that an American rifleman could deliver sustained, accurate fire at a rate that Japanese soldiers, trained to believe in the supremacy of aimed bolt-action fire, simply could not match. The morning of October 23rd would be remembered by the Japanese survivors, not for the American bravery or superior tactics, but for the sheer, overwhelming volume of rifle fire that came pouring out of the jungle. Fire that did not pause, did not slacken, did not give them the brief moments between shots that their doctrine assumed would exist. The Americans just kept shooting, and shooting, and shooting, until the Japanese position, carefully prepared and confidently held, became untenable. To understand how completely the M1 Garand upended Japanese infantry doctrine, one must first understand what that doctrine was, how it developed, and why Japanese soldiers in 1942 believed so absolutely in their superiority as riflemen. The story begins not in the Pacific, but in the mountains of Japan in the late 19th century, when the Meiji government was building a modern army from scratch and looking to the world's military powers for inspiration. The Japanese rifle that confronted American Marines on Guadalcanal traced its lineage to the Meiji 30-year rifle, adopted in 1897. That weapon, itself based on the German Mauser design, established the pattern that Japanese small arms would follow for the next 5 decades. Bolt-action operation, emphasis on accuracy and range, design philosophy centered on the well-trained marksman delivering aimed fire at clearly visible targets. When Colonel Nariakira Arisaka refined the design into what became the Type 38 rifle, adopted in 1905, he created a weapon that perfectly embodied Japanese military thinking about infantry combat. The Arisaka Type 38 fired a 6.5mm round, smaller than the standard ammunition used by most Western armies. This was not a limitation but a deliberate choice. The smaller cartridge produced less recoil, which Japanese planners believed would enable more accurate shooting. It was lighter, allowing soldiers to carry more ammunition, and it was perfectly adequate for the effective ranges at which Japanese doctrine expected infantry engagements to occur, typically between 200 and 400 meters. The rifle itself was beautifully manufactured, using high-quality steel and careful machining. Each weapon was proof-fired at the Koishikawa arsenal and bore the imperial chrysanthemum stamp, indicating it had met the emperor's standards. Soldiers were taught to treat their rifles as sacred objects, to maintain them with religious devotion, to know every part and function intimately. Japanese infantry training emphasized marksmanship above all other skills. Recruits spent months on rifle ranges, learning to judge distance, to adjust for wind and elevation, to control breathing, and squeeze the trigger smoothly. They practiced the bolt-action reload until it became automatic, until they could work the action without conscious thought while keeping their eyes on the target. The Japanese army published extensive marksmanship manuals detailing proper shooting positions, sight picture, and trigger control. Good marksmen were recognized and rewarded. Units competed in shooting competitions. The entire culture of the infantry centered on the rifle and the rifleman's skill. This emphasis on marksmanship was not arbitrary. It reflected Japanese military experience in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, where Japanese infantry using Arisaka rifles had achieved remarkable success through disciplined volley fire and individual marksmanship against Russian forces. At the Battle of Mukden, Japanese infantry had stopped Russian attacks through sustained, accurate fire from defensive positions. The lesson learned was clear. Well-trained riflemen using bolt-action weapons could defeat larger, less disciplined forces through superior shooting. This became gospel in Japanese military doctrine. By the late 1930s, when Japan's war with China intensified and conflict with Western powers became increasingly likely, Japanese infantry doctrine had crystallized around several core assumptions. First, that infantry combat would be decided by aimed rifle fire at medium ranges, typically 200 to 500 meters. Second, that disciplined soldiers firing carefully aimed shots would be more effective than undisciplined soldiers firing rapidly. Third, that the bolt-action rifle represented the optimal balance between accuracy, reliability, and rate of fire for infantry combat. And fourth, that Japanese soldiers, with their superior training and fighting spirit, would naturally outshoot any opponent in a rifle duel. These assumptions were tested and seemingly confirmed in China. Japanese infantry, advancing through Manchuria and into China proper, found their Arisaka rifles effective against Chinese forces that were often poorly equipped and inadequately trained. Chinese soldiers might have rifles, but they rarely had the ammunition for proper training, the discipline for aimed fire under pressure, or the tactical organization to use their weapons effectively. Japanese infantry units consistently achieved fire superiority in engagements, using their rifles to suppress Chinese positions and support infantry assaults. The success in China reinforced every assumption Japanese doctrine held about rifle combat. When Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia in late 1941 and early 1942, these assumptions seemed valid once again. British, Dutch, and American colonial forces in Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies were overwhelmed not by superior Japanese firepower, but by superior tactics, logistics, and operational tempo. The rifles on both sides were broadly similar bolt-action weapons, firing full-power rifle cartridges. Japanese success came from better jungle warfare training, better small unit tactics, and better leadership, not from any fundamental advantage in individual weapons. Japanese military intelligence had information about American small arms, including reports that the United States was fielding a semi-automatic rifle, but these reports were either dismissed or misinterpreted. Semi-automatic rifles, according to Japanese doctrine, sacrificed accuracy for rate of fire. They were more complex, potentially less reliable, wasteful of ammunition. A disciplined soldier with a bolt-action rifle, firing aimed shots, would be more effective than an undisciplined soldier with a semi-automatic rifle spraying bullets. Or so the thinking went. This thinking was not stupid or irrational given Japanese military experience and doctrine. It was logical based on the opponents Japan had faced and the types of combat Japanese forces had encountered. The problem was that American infantry doctrine, American training, and American equipment represented something genuinely different from what Japanese planners expected. The Americans were not undisciplined, they were not poorly trained, and their semi-automatic rifle was not a spray and pray weapon, but a carefully designed tool that fundamentally changed what an infantry rifleman could achieve in combat. The stage was set for a collision between two different philosophies of infantry warfare. On one side, Japanese soldiers with bolt-action rifles, extensive marksmanship training, and absolute confidence in their doctrine. On the other side, American Marines with semi-automatic rifles, adequate training, and a weapon system that Japanese doctrine had not prepared for and could not counter. When these two forces met in the jungles of Guadalcanal, the outcome would reshape how both armies thought about infantry combat for the remainder of the war. The M1 Garand that Marine riflemen carried onto Guadalcanal in August of 1942 was the product of nearly 2 decades of development, testing, and refinement. It represented the United States Army's commitment to a radical idea that every infantryman should have the firepower previously available only to our soldiers with automatic weapons. The rifle's designer, John Cantius Garand, was a Canadian-born engineer who had immigrated to the United States and found work at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. He had been working on semi-automatic rifle designs since the early 1920s, competing against other designers and enduring endless cycles of testing and modification. The rifle that finally emerged from this process and was adopted as the U.S. rifle, caliber .30. M1 in 1936 was a gas-operated, semi-automatic weapon that weighed 9.5 pounds unloaded. It fired the standard .30-06 Springfield cartridge, the same ammunition used in the bolt-action Springfield 1903 rifle it was replacing. This was a deliberate decision. By using existing ammunition, the Army avoided the enormous logistical challenge of introducing a completely new cartridge while still gaining the advantages of semi-automatic operation. The Garand's operating mechanism was elegantly simple. When a round was fired, some of the propellant gas was diverted through a port in the barrel into a gas cylinder beneath the barrel. This gas drove a piston backward, which operated a rotating bolt to extract the spent cartridge case, cock the hammer, and chamber a fresh round from the unblocked clip. The entire cycle took a fraction of a second. The rifleman simply pulled the trigger again, and another round fired. No bolt to work, no manual operation required between shots. Just pull the trigger, and the rifle fired, as fast as the shooter could maintain sight picture and trigger control. The ammunition was fed from an 8-round N-block clip that was inserted into the rifle from the top. When the last round was fired, the clip was automatically ejected with a distinctive metallic ping that would become one of the most recognizable sounds of American infantry in World War II. The rifle was then ready to accept another clip. A trained rifleman could reload in 3 to 5 seconds, far faster than a soldier working a bolt-action rifle could reload from stripper clips or loose rounds. The Garand's practical rate of fire, the rate at which a trained soldier could deliver aimed shots in combat conditions, was approximately 40 to 50 rounds per minute. This was not theoretical rapid fire, pulling the trigger as fast as possible. This was aimed fire, the rifleman acquiring targets, maintaining proper shooting position, controlling breathing and trigger squeeze. 40 to 50 accurate shots per minute. By comparison, a trained soldier with a bolt-action rifle like the Arisaka could achieve perhaps 15 to 20 aimed shots per minute under ideal conditions, and likely fewer under the stress and chaos of actual combat. The difference was not marginal. It was a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 advantage in sustained firepower from individual riflemen, and when multiplied across an entire infantry squad or platoon, the disparity became overwhelming. An American rifle squad with 8 men armed with Garands could deliver somewhere between 300 and 400 aimed shots per minute. A Japanese rifle squad with the same number of men armed with Arisakas could deliver perhaps 120 to 160 shots per minute. The Americans had roughly 3 times the firepower, without deploying any machine guns or automatic weapons. But raw numbers on paper do not capture the full impact of this advantage. The psychological effect of sustained semi-automatic fire was something Japanese infantry doctrine had not considered, and Japanese soldiers had not experienced. When an Arisaka armed soldier fired, he then had to work the bolt. Pull up, pull back to extract the spent case, push forward to chamber a new round, push down to lock the bolt. During that half-second to full second of mechanical operation, he was not shooting. He was not observing the enemy. He was working his rifle. American Marine with a Garand fired and was immediately ready to fire again. His sight picture never changed. His position never shifted. The rifle did all the mechanical work. He just kept shooting. American training emphasized this advantage. Marines were taught to use the Garand's semi-automatic capability to maintain continuous fire on enemy positions. The doctrine was not to spray bullets wildly, but to deliver rapid, aimed fire that would suppress enemy soldiers, prevent them from shooting back effectively, and allow friendly forces to maneuver. A Marine rifle squad advancing under fire would use a technique called marching fire, where some riflemen moved forward while others fired at known or suspected enemy positions. Then the roles reversed. The sustained fire from the Garands made this tactic practical in ways that would have been impossible with bolt-action rifles. The Marines who landed on Guadalcanal in August of 1942 were among the first American ground forces to engage Japanese infantry in sustained combat. They had trained with the M1 Garand, many of them for only a few months, but they understood the weapon's capabilities. They knew they could shoot faster than any enemy with a bolt-action rifle. What they did not fully understand yet was how that advantage would manifest in actual jungle combat against an enemy who believed absolutely in his own superiority as a rifleman. The initial landings on August 7th met relatively light resistance. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were primarily construction troops working on an airfield, not frontline infantry. But as American forces established their perimeter around the airfield, renamed Henderson Field, Japanese reinforcements began arriving. Among them were experienced infantry units, soldiers who had fought in China, who had trained extensively in marksmanship, who carried their Arisaka rifles with confidence born from years of success. The first serious infantry engagements occurred in late August along the Ilu River, misidentified by Marines as the Tenaru. Japanese forces, approximately 900 men from the Ichiki detachment, launched a night attack against Marine positions. The battle was chaotic, fought at close range in darkness, with Japanese soldiers attempting to overrun Marine foxholes through sheer aggression and shock tactics. The Garands' advantage was less pronounced in this kind of confused, close-quarters fighting where the combat often devolved to hand-to-hand struggles. But as the campaign continued through September and into October, the pattern of combat shifted. Japanese forces, reinforced and better organized, began conducting more deliberate attacks and establishing more robust defensive positions. American Marines, pushing inland from their perimeter, encountered Japanese infantry in the jungle, in prepared positions, at ranges where rifle fire was the decisive weapon. It was in these engagements that the Garands' advantage became overwhelmingly apparent. On October 23rd, elements of the 1st Marine Division's 7th Regiment advanced through the jungle west of Henderson Field, moving toward Japanese positions along a ridgeline overlooking the Matanikau River. Intelligence indicated Japanese forces held the high ground in strength. The attack would require advancing uphill through heavy vegetation against entrenched defenders, exactly the kind of engagement where Japanese doctrine suggested their superior marksmanship would prevail. The Marines moved through the jungle in squad columns, maintaining tactical spacing, weapons ready. Japanese observers on the ridgeline spotted them and reported back to their commanders. Japanese infantry soldiers, positioned in foxholes and behind natural cover, checked their rifles and prepared to demonstrate what well-trained marksmen could accomplish against overconfident Americans. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Marines reached the base of the ridgeline and began their advance. Japanese soldiers, following doctrine, allowed them to close to effective rifle range approximately 200 to 300 meters before opening fire. The first shots cracked through the jungle with the sharp report of Arisaka rifles. Marines dropped into cover. Some returned fire immediately. Others scanned the ridgeline, trying to spot Japanese positions through the vegetation. What happened next was not a dramatic, singular moment, but rather a grinding revelation that unfolded over hours of combat. The Marines did not charge the ridge in a wild assault. They did not rely primarily on supporting machine guns or mortars, though these weapons certainly contributed. Instead, they did something that Japanese defenders found increasingly difficult to counter. They established firing positions and began systematically suppressing the Japanese positions, with sustained rifle fire from their M1 Garands. A Marine squad would identify a suspected Japanese position, a muzzle flash, movement in the vegetation, a likely piece of cover. Half the squad would open fire on that position, delivering rapid, aimed shots. Not one shot and then work the bolt. Not careful, deliberate shooting with long pauses between rounds. Continuous fire. 8 rounds from each Garand, then a quick reload, then 8 more rounds. The volume of fire on a single Japanese position was something the defenders had not experienced before, and their doctrine had not prepared them for. Japanese soldiers in the targeted positions found themselves unable to return effective fire. Every time they tried to rise to shoot, tried to acquire a target, tried to aim carefully as their training demanded, bullets were cracking past their heads or impacting their cover. The fire did not pause long enough for them to shoot back effectively. They would get off one shot, maybe 2, before having to duck back down as more rounds came in. Meanwhile, the other half of the Marine squad was advancing, moving to better positions, outflanking the suppressed Japanese defenders. One Japanese soldier, later captured after being wounded, told American interrogators that he had fired perhaps 10 shots during an engagement that lasted over an hour, not because he was conserving ammunition or being particularly careful, because every time he attempted to fire, American bullets forced him back into cover. He described the sound of the American fire as continuous, like a drumbeat, like something that never stopped. He had expected to engage in a rifle duel, marksman against marksman, where his superior training would tell. Instead, he found himself pinned down, unable to shoot, watching his position become untenable as Marines advanced from multiple directions. Another captured Japanese soldier, a sergeant with combat experience in China, reported that his initial assumption was that the Americans must be using machine guns. The volume of fire seemed too great to be coming from individual rifles. Only later, when he saw captured American weapons, did he understand that the standard American infantry rifle was semi-automatic. He described feeling betrayed by his own leadership, who had assured him that Japanese marksmanship training would compensate for any equipment differences. How, he asked his interrogators, was superior marksmanship supposed to matter when you could not safely expose yourself to take an aimed shot? The tactical reality was brutally simple. Japanese soldiers with Arisakas could not maintain fire superiority against Marines with Garands. The semi-automatic rifle gave American infantry the ability to deliver sustained, suppressive fire that bolt-action rifles simply could not match. This meant that American squads could suppress Japanese positions while maneuvering, could maintain continuous fire during advances, could respond to enemy fire with immediate and overwhelming return fire. The Japanese infantry found themselves consistently outgunned at the squad level, in exactly the type of medium-range rifle combat their doctrine said they should dominate. The Battle of the Matanikau, in late October, was not a single engagement but rather a series of actions as Marines pushed westward against Japanese positions. In each engagement, the pattern repeated. Japanese forces, often in good defensive positions with clear fields of fire, found themselves unable to hold against sustained pressure from American rifle squads. The M1 Garand gave Marines a tactical flexibility and firepower advantage that Japanese infantry could not counter with their bolt-action Arisakas, no matter how well trained the individual Japanese soldiers were as marksmen. Japanese military intelligence collected reports from Guadalcanal throughout the fall of 1942. Unit commanders submitted after-action reports. Wounded soldiers evacuated from the island told their stories to medical personnel and rear echelon officers. The pattern that emerged from these accounts was consistent and disturbing. American infantry possessed a significant firepower advantage at the individual rifleman level. Japanese soldiers were being consistently outgunned in rifle engagements, not because of poor training or inadequate courage, but because American rifles could fire much faster. The Imperial Japanese Army's response to this intelligence reveals much about institutional rigidity and the difficulty of changing doctrine mid-war. Initial reports were met with skepticism. Some officers suggested that soldiers were exaggerating American firepower to excuse their own failures. Others argued that the reported fire rates must be coming from machine guns or automatic rifles, not standard infantry weapons. The idea that America had equipped its entire infantry with semi-automatic rifles seemed improbable, wasteful, the kind of industrial excess that supposedly characterized American military thinking but would surely prove impractical in sustained combat. But as more reports arrived, as more soldiers confirmed the same story, as captured American rifles were examined by Japanese ordnance experts, the truth became undeniable. The Americans had indeed fielded a semi-automatic rifle as their standard infantry weapon. The M1 Garand was not a specialized weapon issued to select troops. It was not an automatic rifle for squad support. It was the rifle that every American soldier and Marine carried. And it worked. It was reliable in jungle conditions, maintainable by ordinary soldiers, and devastatingly effective in combat. Japanese military planners faced an uncomfortable question. What could be done about this? The obvious solution, develop and produce a semi-automatic rifle for Japanese infantry, was easier proposed than accomplished. Japan had been working on semi-automatic rifle designs since the late 1930s. Several prototypes had been developed, tested, and found wanting. The Type 4 rifle, a gas-operated semi-automatic weapon, showed promise but required extensive refinement. The Type 5 rifle, essentially a copy of the American M1 Garand manufactured from captured examples and technical drawings, was even more promising but came too late in the war to matter. Production was the fundamental obstacle. Even if Japanese designers could perfect a semi-automatic rifle, manufacturing it in quantities sufficient to re-equip the infantry would require industrial capacity that Japan simply did not have. The Garand was a complex weapon compared to a bolt-action rifle, requiring precision machining, high-quality steel, and sophisticated quality control. American industry could produce these rifles by the hundreds of thousands. Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms together manufactured over 4 million Garands during the war. Japanese industry, strained by aircraft, production, naval construction, and the demands of a multi-front war, could not remotely match this output. The mathematics were stark and unforgiving. In 1943, American factories produced approximately 1 million M1 Garand rifles. In the same year, Japanese factories produced approximately 200,000 Arisaka rifles of all types. The production ratio was 5-to-1, and that was for the older, simpler bolt-action design. If Japan attempted to shift to semi-automatic rifle production, output would drop even further during the transition, leaving frontline units short of weapons entirely. Japanese planners understood this. They understood that American industrial capacity was fundamentally different from their own, that the United States could afford to equip every rifleman with a sophisticated semi-automatic weapon, while Japan struggled to produce sufficient quantities of much simpler bolt-action rifles. The Garand was not just a better rifle. It was a symbol of the industrial disparity between the two nations, a disparity that manifested in every aspect of the war, from ship construction to aircraft production to the rifles in soldiers' hands. Unable to match American firepower rifle for rifle, Japanese doctrine attempted to adapt in other ways. Training emphasized night attacks and close combat, where the Garand's rate of fire advantage would be less decisive. Infantry units were instructed to close with American forces rapidly, to get inside the effective range of American rifles where combat became hand-to-hand. Defensive tactics emphasized prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire, where Japanese machine guns could compensate for the individual rifleman's firepower disadvantage. These tactical adaptations had some success, particularly early in engagements when American forces were unprepared or when Japanese forces achieved surprise. But they could not overcome the fundamental problem. In sustained infantry combat at medium ranges, American rifle squads could deliver roughly 3 times the firepower of equivalent Japanese units. This advantage affected every subsequent Pacific campaign, on Tarawa in November 1943, on Saipan in June 1944, on Peleliu in September 1944, on Iwo Jima in February 1945, on Okinawa in April 1945. The pattern repeated. Japanese infantry, often fighting from prepared defensive positions with every geographical advantage, found themselves unable to maintain fire superiority against American infantry equipped with M1 Garands. Individual Japanese soldiers, many of them experienced veterans with years of training, recognized what this meant. They were not being defeated because they were poor soldiers or because their fighting spirit was inadequate. They were being defeated because they had been equipped with rifles designed for a previous generation of warfare and sent to fight an enemy whose standard infantry weapon represented something genuinely new. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. Soldiers who had been taught that Japanese training and discipline would overcome any material disadvantages discovered that some material disadvantages were simply too large to overcome. Post-war interviews with Japanese veterans reveal a consistent theme. Many expressed respect, sometimes grudging, for American infantry firepower. They described the experience of facing sustained semi-automatic rifle fire as unlike anything their training had prepared them for. They talked about the sound of it, the continuous crackle of rifle fire that never seemed to pause or diminish. They described the tactical impossibility of returning effective fire when American riflemen could shoot 3 or 4 rounds in the time it took to work a bolt action once, and they expressed anger, not at their American opponents, but at their own military leadership for sending them into combat with equipment everyone knew was inferior. One veteran, interviewed decades after the war, described his first encounter with American Marines on Guadalcanal. He had been confident, well-trained, certain in his superiority as a rifleman. The engagement lasted perhaps 20 minutes. His squad was forced to withdraw, having accomplished nothing, after taking casualties without inflicting any. What he remembered most clearly was not the fear or the casualties, but the realization that struck him as he retreated through the jungle. His rifle, the weapon he had trained with for years, the weapon he had been taught was superior to anything the enemy possessed, was obsolete. The Americans had simply moved on to the next generation of infantry weapons, and Japan had not. The M1 Garand's impact extended beyond its immediate tactical advantages. It represented a philosophical difference in how the two nations approached warfare. American military doctrine emphasized firepower and material, superiority. If giving every infantryman a semi-automatic rifle provided a tactical advantage, then American industry would manufacture millions of semi-automatic rifles. The complexity of the weapon, the cost of production, the logistical burden of maintaining sophisticated equipment in field conditions, these were problems to be solved, not reasons to settle for simpler equipment. Japanese military doctrine, by contrast, emphasized training, discipline, and fighting spirit. Equipment was important, but the quality of the soldier was paramount. A well-trained soldier with a simple, reliable bolt-action rifle was the ideal. Sophisticated equipment might fail, might require maintenance beyond the capabilities of ordinary soldiers, might encourage reliance on material rather than spiritual factors. This philosophy had served Japan well against opponents in China and Southeast Asia, who lacked both the training and the equipment to compete effectively. But against the United States, a nation that could provide both well-trained soldiers and superior equipment in overwhelming quantities, this philosophy proved inadequate. The story of Japanese infantry encountering the M1 Garand is ultimately a story about the limits of training and doctrine when faced with fundamental technological disparity. Japanese soldiers were not poorly trained, they were not lacking in courage or dedication. Many were experienced veterans who had survived multiple campaigns, but they had been equipped to fight a type of war that no longer existed, against an enemy who no longer used the weapons Japanese doctrine assumed he would use. And once that reality became clear, once the gap between what Japanese soldiers had been told and what they experienced in combat became undeniable, no amount of training or fighting spirit could close it. The soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and subsequent campaigns carried this knowledge with them. They knew, even if their commanders were reluctant to admit it officially, that they were fighting at a significant disadvantage. They knew that American riflemen could shoot faster, and that this advantage was not something that could be overcome through better tactics or more aggressive fighting. They knew that their rifles, well-made and reliable as they were, belonged to an earlier era of warfare, and they knew that Japan's industrial capacity could not produce the weapons that might have evened the odds. This knowledge did not make them surrender. Japanese infantry continued fighting with ferocious determination on every Pacific battlefield until the war's end. But the confidence that had characterized Japanese infantry in the early war years was gone, replaced by a grim understanding of material realities. The Arisaka rifle that had seemed perfectly adequate for infantry combat in China proved inadequate against American Marines with Garands. The marksmanship training that had been the foundation of Japanese infantry doctrine could not compensate for a 3-to-1 disadvantage in firepower, and the fighting spirit that Japanese military culture emphasized above all else could not stop semi-automatic rifle fire. When Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal first encountered sustained fire from M1 Garands, they experienced a moment of clarity that would define the rest of their war. The Americans were not slow firers. They were not poorly trained. They were not reliant on spray and pray tactics that wasted ammunition. They were competent infantrymen equipped with a weapon system that fundamentally changed what a rifle squad could accomplish in combat, and Japan had no answer to it. The industrial and technological gap between the two nations, visible in naval construction and aircraft production, existed even at the level of the individual infantryman's rifle. That gap would never close. It would only widen as the war continued, as American production accelerated and Japanese industry strained under bombing and blockade. The soldiers who recognized this reality in October 1942 on a ridgeline above the Matanikau River were simply the first of many who would learn the same bitter lesson across the Pacific. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.